so that you can't see my eyes. So I'm going to see if I can do this without my reading glasses. So we'll see how it goes. I won't go through this. You all, I think, have seen a copy of this. This is just a little bit of background on me and where I come from, and going from psychotherapy out into the world and trying to do my own version of what some of us think of as world therapy. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a heads up about what we're going to go through. And in this presentation, and we'll go for about an hour, and then after that, I'll be happy to take questions and comments and have some discussion. I want to talk a little bit about the psychology in particular of making deep change in the world through telling new stories or new versions of old stories, and how that can be powerful. And I'm going to mention a little bit of the science and leave you with some concrete suggestions for how to actually do this, because I don't teach theory for theory's sake. We need to actually use it. So the second thing as part of this is I'm going to introduce this term terrapsychology, which some of us have been using for some time now to talk about how the world really gets into us psychologically, and how what we think of sometimes as our internal life is intimately bound up with what happens in the world. Oops, sorry, I hit the wrong button. Let's go back. So after that, I'm going to give you some specific examples of how people actually use terrapsychology. What can you actually do with this? And after that, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and narrow our attention to one aspect of terrapsychology, which some of us have been referring to as enchantivism. So, and why enchantment? Why that word? And what's the psychology involved in that? And why is it important? So we'll touch on that too. And then we'll go through examples of people who I think of as the people I look up to who are enchantitivists and making real change through effective telling of stories in different forms. And then at the very end, I'll just bring up a screen with some resources if you have further interest in pursuing these topics. So that's what I have planned for us today, and then Q&A at the end. So it won't surprise anybody in this presentation that there's a lot going on in the world if you read the news at all. And so I won't dwell on that part, but what I do want to point out is that there are also many ways to make change in the world. So we have people out in the streets right now trying to make change and even risking their lives to keep intact the rights that we still have. They're out there working really hard. I come from two families, adoptive and birth, and my birth family is full of firefighters, and I think about them and how they've put their lives at risk to keep people safe. That's not necessarily a form of activism, but it is a form of helping people in the world. We have ecologists out there doing good science on what's happening to the planet itself. And then the tremendously important work in environmental justice, which goes on all over the world. And there are names like Vandana Shiva and Robert Bullard and a number of others, Linda Buzzell, and many people working on this. So I'm acknowledging up front that there's lots of ways to do this. And what I want to present is not intended as an alternative. The more time that you put into your version of this, your version of getting active, the better. And what I want to offer instead is what you can do in addition to. So that brings us to storytelling from the edge. And here I want to show you a couple of examples of people who are doing this right now. And you'll recognize some or all of these faces. I just want to quickly touch on why these people are important in terms of this presentation. And so starting with Ava DuVernay, she, right from the beginning, right from childhood, had a sense that she was going to be involved in film somehow. So we've all heard that nice phrase, follow your bliss, which comes from Joseph Campbell. But the phrase that we don't often hear is another one that he spoke about this, which is that when you follow your bliss, it means that you're following your blisters. And it's hard sometimes, especially when you grow up in a situation that already put you back some. She kept at it. And in interviews, she has said that I just knew I had to be around films and filmmakers. And so she did that. She took crappy jobs just to be in the vicinity of people who were making films. And at one point, she said, you know, I think I can do this. If I scrape together a little bit of money, I think I can do maybe 12 minutes of film, and then I'm going to show it to some people and just see how it comes out. And she did that, and that launched her career. So Selma and all the other things that she filmed lay in the future. So making change through film is one way of telling stories on the edge. Underneath her, of course, is George Takei. A lot of us grew up seeing him play Sulu in Star Trek on the bridge of the Enterprise. He also went through the Japanese internment during World War II, and he puts on plays and has done a lot of work and storybooks and other media to talk about not just what that did to him and his family and thousands of other Japanese Americans, but what he learned from that and how he's moving forward with his own agenda of justice. So George Takei. And then up to the right a little bit, that would be the author of Hope in the Dark, Rebecca Solnit. And I recommend that book because it has many examples of successful kinds of activism in it. Oftentimes what we hear emphasized is the injustice piece, which needs to be spoken. We need to go know what's going on in the world. But then she adds the whole part about, and this is how it turned out successfully, and this is how we changed, and this is how it made better community in the world. So Hope in the Dark is one of her many books. She's a wonderful writer, and I recommend reading as much of her as you can. Below her is somebody I had the pleasure of actually talking to more than once and meeting with him, Devdutt Patnaik. And he's from India, and he has almost single-handedly taken this huge body of Hindu sacred stories, which in the West are often referred to as myths. Another Campbell quotation is that we say myth when we mean other people's religions, right? So Hindu sacred stories. And what he does is he retells them through the lens of diversity. This is what the old stories tell us about many different kinds of people in many different kinds of relationships. And so that's what he brings as well. He's fascinating to talk to and also to listen to. And then of course on the right is John Lewis, who died not all that long ago, holding up one of the books, one of the several books that he's been responsible for. And you know, one of the things I like about this picture of him is that if you notice in the background, he's at Comic-Con. He showed up one year at Comic-Con, which is a huge comic book extravaganza of lots of different people and speakers and cultures. And he showed up dressed as his younger self, which I just think is great. So that's him doing that right there. So all examples of people who are telling different stories, new stories, alternative stories from the edge. And let's not forget Gloria Anzaldúa. Her book La Frontera, which is usually translated as Borderland, hugely influential to not only Chicana feminists, but lots of different people who are trying to live between cultures, particularly when you come from areas where you're a bit of this and you're a bit of that, and how can I make these work together in societies that don't recognize either one? So she also, by the way, has resurrected Aztec mythology and told it from a queer perspective, a social justice perspective, and then many others too, including a psychological perspective. One of the schools I went to, Pacifica Graduate Institute, used to have her come and present every now and then. So this next piece, restoring, and I like playing with that word because it sounds a bit like restoring as well. Restoring how we live with ourselves, each other, and our planet. I want to start by this slide by saying that we have to have all of those together. When we focus only on one, we miss the picture of their relationships. And if the relationships is where the reality is, relationship is where the juice is. So whenever I think about ecological work, for instance, I always think about the other two as well. So I wanted to give you a few examples of stories that have been told about how we should relate to the planet in a way that not only looks out for ourselves and our own well-being, but looks out for the planet too. So I'm going to start with one that's historically been least preoccupied with that and most internal in its perspective, depth psychology. It's usually defined as the psychology of the unconscious, or the psychology that looks at our relations with the unconscious. When people train for clinical psychology work, they usually see a little bit of this under the rubric of psychodynamic. And so depth psychology teaches us that when things occur, not just dreams and images from art, but lots of other things too, as I'll give you examples of momentarily, we can think of them as symbols. And they're not just straight up signs that mean only one thing. It's of the nature of a symbol that it can refer to many things. There's always a part of it that's kind of mysterious and undefinable. So whenever we're working with the symbols of dreams, or in terms of terrapsychology, which I'm about to come to, when we look at events in the world through a symbolic lens, we're not trying to just pop a label on it and say, this is what it means for all time. We're listening in with more of a symbolic listening. So more on that momentarily. So we get a bit of that from depth psychology, but as I mentioned, its orientation is primarily internal. Part of my training at the master's level was in family systems. Fascinating stuff. It was such a revelation. Looking at the family as a total personality, as an organism that does all kinds of things unconsciously. It organizes roles, and it has certain rules that people obey unconsciously, and there are boundaries that are either open or closed, and long family legacies that get handed down from the ancestors, and they show up as bits of personal psychology in us that we don't always connect backward to where we came from. So that was, when I got exposed to it, that was a pretty eye-opening perspective. And I'll give you a small example of one thing that shifts. This is a very, very small example, but in my birth family, my birth mother, when she was still alive, never got along with my uncle, her brother. They had a lifelong feud. She was the older one, he was younger. She was very rebellious. She was an eternal outlaw. My uncle was very, what some people would call respectable, at least that's how he thought of himself. Very proper, kind of the family hero, you know, I'm going to uphold the rules and I'm going to be the second parent and all that. And my mother wasn't having it. So they never got along. And psychology usually explains that in terms of sibling rivalry. But from a family systems perspective, what that also looks like is what they call role collision. So my uncle had one role, the hero of the family. My mother had another role, the outlaw of the family. Nobody decided on a conscious level that they were going to grow up in these roles. It's of the nature of the family as a system that it self-organizes and it gets things done in the world by having people kind of unconsciously grow up in these different roles. And so when you're aware of what the role is, you can start doing things differently and saying yes or no to it, making creative use of it, having some fun with it. One of my enduring fantasies is that I wish that my mother and my uncle had been in a family therapy session with a family therapist who would invite them for a week to shift roles, and to tell my mother, okay, for a week, you're going to be the respectable, follow the rule person. And for a week, you, the uncle, you're going to be rebellious. I think they would have learned a lot about each other if they had done that. So seeing not just family systems, but big social systems as being their own kind of entity with their own self-organizing processes. So that's another lens, another story for how we can see ourselves with each other and on our world. A third one that I'll mention, ecopsychology. So this is a relatively recent field, but with ancient roots, pretty much in all cultures. And the more recent version of this started actually in the San Francisco Bay Area in the mid 1900s. And the basic idea of ecopsychology is that psychology and environmentalism need to talk to each other. They shouldn't be like my uncle and my mother. They need to get along because human beings are nature. We do come from Earth. We live on Earth. And so a basic premise that I think all ecopsychologists share is that for human beings to be fully human and healthy, we need to live in fully healthy surroundings. And when we're destroying our surroundings, we're also destroying our own health. Since 1995, I think, when the first ecopsychology volume came out, full of different voices in it, there's been research done on this, and there's actually quite a lot at this point backing it up. So that's a third perspective. And then I'll mention the last one, which comes out of ecopsychology, ecotherapy, which is the actual practice of ecopsychology. You know, these are great ideas about human health and the health of our surroundings and all that, but what do we actually do with that? And so ecotherapy emphasizes this is what you do. This is how you have greater contact with plants and animals. And this part in particular has a lot of research behind it as well for anybody who needs that piece. So it doesn't always go under the name ecotherapy, but if you go on the internet and surf around and you look up something like nature and human health, you'll see studies all over the place on this. And that connection is so powerful that even people, like to cite one example of thousands, let's say you have heart surgery and you're in the hospital. So in the studies that they've done, if you have a window looking out onto a natural landscape, you will generally recover faster than somebody who doesn't have that window. People living in a home together who all have dementia tend to be less combative if there's just things like plants around them. So I'm mentioning something that's a fairly surface part of ecotherapy. It actually goes much deeper than this. And an additional question that ecotherapy poses is, you know, instead of just mining nature for its healthy effects, how can we actually change our relationship to it? So those are 4 different lenses for looking at our relationship to the natural world. And it felt to me as a graduate student years ago that these were very useful lenses, but it seemed like something was missing. So I was out walking one day and I was thinking about how whatever I came across felt like a part of my own mind, a part of my own psyche. And I was having dreams about places I lived in where the place would show up as a personified figure. It's almost magical the way the mind can do that. It can take just about any psychological material and turn it into a character. Carl Jung called that personification. And so that was happening. Places I lived in were showing up in my dreams saying, go look at this and go look at that. And then I would go there and it would be like it was in the dream. And, you know, I didn't grow up in an indigenous worldview. I didn't grow up thinking animistically. So all this was very puzzling to me. And so I studied the lenses that I just mentioned to you, and they helped, but there was something about the depth and intimacy of that connection that still felt like it was being left out. So in this perspective that some of us call terrapsychology, which has been going on now for actually quite some time, terrapsychology is a growing and evolving body of studies and ideas and practices for actually tracing this deep intimacy, this deep connection between what we usually think of as inner and outer, and how incredibly close that connection is between us and the things of the world. And there's a kind of a saying that some of us have that goes with this: everything converses. So maybe a couple of quick examples to make this more concrete. One is that those of us who practice this, and there's about, I don't know, maybe 20 of us who do it consistently, and then many more who have done research with what we're calling Terrapsychological Inquiry. We don't live anymore in a world that's silent, that's a world of just objects and things. For us, everything is speaking somehow. And I don't mean that rocks have minds or anything like that in the literal sense, but what I do mean is it's almost as though everything has its own interiority or its own presence for us. And so when we look around at the world, we feel like we belong here, like we're actually in conversation with everything. And since trying out these ideas as a graduate student, I've had the honor of talking many times to people who come from animistic cultures where this kind of perception is actually valued, and seeing how they perceive the world and learning a little from them about that too. And my impression is that it's possible for those of us like me who didn't grow up in that kind of culture, nevertheless, to get at least some sense of what it's like to live in a world that's actually alive and speaking. So to give you kind of a trivial example of how this might work, just with ordinary objects, when I teach this, oftentimes I'll ask the students to think about everyday objects that are around them, like, you know, reading glasses or a phone or whatever it is, and consider their relationship to it. And I'll ask them, did you ever lose it? Did it ever disappear and you just couldn't find it? And does that coincide with anything going on with you? And so to give you a couple of quick anecdotes about this, whenever I buy anything new, I try to actually spend some time with it. And what I mean by that is I get a sense of what it's made of and how it feels and how my senses wake up to it, and what it smells like, what it, you know, how it fits, if it's clothing. And then I try to find out something about the people who made it and where they are and what their lives are like, and it, you know, filling in the story of whatever it is. And so a couple of semesters ago, I bought it was time for a new wallet, just a small thing that I carry in my front pocket. So it arrived and I grabbed it and I went out the door to work, which in my case is school. Went to school, taught, and then there was a break. I went to the men's room, came back, and then one of my students came back right after me, and he goes, "Oh, this was in the men's room, and I think it's yours." And it was my wallet. It had popped out of my pocket. So in maybe 20 years of doing this, that was one of the few times that I ever didn't get to know something up close, and I lost it the day that I acquired it, right? So I went home that evening and I went, okay, I need to get to know you better. So as a result, except for that, I don't lose things. So a question that this raises is, how can we have a conscious relationship not only to things, but to houses, to apartments, to neighborhoods, to our transportation, public or private or what have you, to the world itself? All one big conversation. And another way of putting this is, how do we live in a world of presences and not objects? Now, as part of this, and I've kind of been doing this implicitly, I'm drawing on traditions that honor the imagination and consider it more than just thinking up stuff. And so depth psychology is one place to start with this, but there are many traditions going far back that regard the imagination as a primal power, one that we actually share with other animals. And so according to this way of holding imagination as we practice it terrapsychologically, when you think about it, anything that we plan as human beings, anything that we achieve, anything that we eventually end up doing, somehow there's some kind of a fantasy about it at the beginning. A fantasy about what we want or where we're going or what can I make. And it often appears as an internal image of some kind. That's imagination. So imagining is actually more than just a mental exercise. It's actually embodied. And, you know, I think all of us have imagined in the form of a worry, you know, oh, something terrible is going to happen, and what do I do about this? And So we're imagining the worst, and we know when we're doing that it's not just mental. Our whole body's in it, our feelings are in it, right? So imagining is more than just the mind doing things. Possibly one reason that we have imagination is so we can test new possibilities without actually having to do them and see what happens. So there's a pragmatic piece to that. Also, to name one of many traditions around the world, there used to be something called the Way of Hermes Thrice Great, the Way of Thrice Great Hermes. It goes all the way back through history to Egypt, and it originated with the esoteric priests who studied the way of, he's been pronounced different ways, but I'll say Thoth. He's also been pronounced Thoth, and we're quite sure how to get his name right, but he is one of the gods of the Egyptian pantheon, and he is, you could think of him as a magus, by which I mean different kinds of magician, wizard, people who work with magic, that kind of thing. And so when we talk about a Hermetic tradition, at this point, we're talking about a worldwide tradition that originates in Egypt, that has gone many different places. And one of its primary ideas is that imagination is a basic way that we appreciate the beauty of the world. So I'm actually writing a book right now on Hermeticism as a lost esoteric practice of honoring Earth. And it also has a strong ethical system as well. So when we honor the Earth, we take care of each other too, in this way of holding things. Some of us have heard about Romanticism in Europe, in literature, in music, in the arts. That was another movement that was heavily influenced by Hermeticism, actually, and has a lot to do with bringing poetry and even sacred stories, folklore, things like that into the mix in terms of how to appreciate the natural world. And then there's just the nature and communal wisdom that's found in folklore from all different places. Oftentimes when you read the old stories with a symbolic eye, you can see a lot in them about how to be in the natural world, how to be with it, how to invite it into our homes and our cities, what happens when we're at odds with it. There's lots of stories about that. And if there's time at the end, if you're curious about that, ask me for a couple and I can give you the brief versions of that. So how does this look in action? So I'll mention a few examples. Garrett Barnwell is from South Africa, and he has been invited to work with some tribes out there who have been absolutely devastated, not just by apartheid, but by apartheid industries that have basically logged down their sacred places. And so in conjunction with trying to regrow trees and replant entire devastated ecoregions, the people who live out there are also trying to work with their own stories. And so he's out there helping them do that because, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the old stories have a lot to say about how to reconnect ourselves with the natural world. So Sherry Gobeleza and Hiroko Shiota from two different cultures also talk a lot and write a lot about appreciating the nature practices that come out of their cultures of origin. Sherry's is from Puerto Rico, and there's words in her language that talk about intimate connections with nature and the words don't exist in English. So there's something for us to learn there. And then Hiroko did some doctoral work based partly in Shinto, which reveres the sacredness of the land and its active forces, which are referred to as kami. So Phoenix is on this list, as well as one of my former students, Mike Haber, studying how ecological trauma and human trauma go together and how the healing of both can also go together as well. So in Mike Haber's case, he is partly of Native American ancestry, and he grew up near the San Lorenzo River in Santa Cruz. And he noticed from out of his life experience that oftentimes people who were suffering from addictions and were homeless tended to hang out in the most ecologically damaged parts of that river. And he got curious about that. So that's what he ended up doing his doctoral research on. He is now putting together a nonprofit to address that problem. And then Lolly Mitchell and Amanda Leach, both working with art in the natural world, but also with it as, not as a place just to get interesting artistic materials, but actually as a partner in the work, the presence of nature as a partner. I think too of the work of Andy Goldsworthy as well. Some of you have heard of him. And then studying how the presence of place informs personal and community psychology. So C.K. Olivieri was one of my students as well. And she got curious around a particular research interest. She asked herself, how come people who identify as queer tend to gravitate and find sanctuary in certain parts of San Francisco? And so that was the beginning, that curiosity was the beginning of a research project she did at the doctoral level. Why are some places like that? It was fascinating work. Her dissertation's got a great title. It's called, what is it? I can't remember the name of it now. I'll think of it later. Something like Your City, My Bar, or something like that. But anyway, I recommend it. And I have to mention too that terrapsychology didn't just emerge out of nowhere. Like ecopsychology, it has indigenous roots, but it also has cultural roots as well. And I was reading Du Bois a while ago, and I came across this passage from The Souls of Black Folk, and I went, wow, this guy was doing terrapsychology before any of us even thought of it. So one of the things he does in this paragraph is he's aware that Atlanta, as he knows it, is being industrialized out of existence, and he has a certain emotional connection to that place. And so one of the moves that he makes is he brings in a story from ancient mythology, and he combines that with the politics and ecology of what's actually happening. And he found a story that really speaks to the condition of Atlanta at the time that he wrote this. So he thinks about Atalanta, who is a figure a bit like wild Artemis, who is a nature goddess in Greek mythology, and how no one could actually grab her and pin her down until one person had the idea of tricking her with golden apples, and she looked down and saw them and was spellbound by how beautiful they were. And then at that point, she was captured. And so the point that Du Bois makes is this is what happened to the city as well. So he was doing this stuff way back. Another example of that too. So I highly recommend this book by Professor Kim Ruffin. It's full of all kinds of great information about how going all the way back into the slave days, Black people recognized the presence and ecology and deep interrelationships between themselves and the places that they were living, working, suffering in. And so there's a poem here by George Horton, who is an escaped slave. And I'll just read it really briefly because it's so poignant. We have some of this poetry, not all of it survived, but he writes, "'Tis like the loss of paradise, or Eden's garden left in gloom, where grief affords us no device, such as thy lot, my native home. How can I from my secret remove and leave my ever devoted home and the dear garden which I love, the beauty of my native home?" There's a film that came from a book of the same title, Tending the Wild. And this film talks about the indigenous practice of what's being called traditional ecological knowledge, or TECH for short. And as I sit here in California and watch the fires burn, I'm forcibly reminded of how ignoring the fire regimens of indigenous Californians have got us to this place. It's partly climate change too, but there's a component of the other as well. And so this quotation comes from Ron Good, who is a chief of the North Folk Mono Tribe, and he says, actually not writes, you have to know how to work with fire. And he said this in response to being asked in the film during the 2017 fires that broke out in California. They were asking him, well, what do you know? Where does your knowledge play into what's happening now? And so he said, you have to know how to work with fire. This land needs fire. You need to be able to see through the trees. It's such an interesting move. When the baby is inside the basket, look through the basket. See the world. Always the ability to see through. This is what I mean when I talk about symbolic consciousness. To not only look at the surface of things, but to look at the symbolism of things and the meaning of things. He's putting it much better than I do. So one other example here of what we can do with terrapsychology. It was hard to pare down examples for this, but I tried my best. So there's some research being done right now on Mycobacteria bacchae, which is a soil bacterium. And it looks like, and the research at this point is preliminary, but it looks like it's got all these good effects on human health. Look at this list. I mean, stress, tuberculosis, depression, and so on. I sometimes invite my students to scoop up a handful of fresh soil and hold it for 20 minutes, which seems to be how long it takes for it to start working. And so that's the scientific piece, the ecological medical piece. The terrapsychological piece would be to go into it and ask, in the spirit of seeing through, how might we use this as an example of something that can open us up to the abundance and the healing and the presence of the ground that we're living on? And what do the old stories here tell us about how all that works? And equally important, what can we give back? So a few suggestions along the lines of re-emplacing ourselves in the natural world. This was written by Matt Cochran. He's one of our group of people that do a lot of terrapsychological work. And right now he's in Boulder, Utah, and he's teaching these ideas to an entire community out there where he lives. Him and his partner are doing that. And I just wanted to include a quotation from here because he writes so beautifully. How if you take human psychology, which has its own language of, drives and these days circuits and all that stuff, Matt came along and said, well, what if you just translate that into natural language, ecological language? So he's a geologist. And so one of his perspectives is that when we talk about psychological defenses to protect ourselves from harm, we're also talking about weathering. And so he says we're born with fault lines, fractional lines, crystalline structures, and so on, all of which get weathered down over time. And so when we look at the mind that way, through that lens, we see something different than we do if we just look at it psychologically. Which brings us to enchantment. So why is enchantment important as a psychology? Well, it's refreshing, for one thing. If you recall the last time you were in an enchanted mood, you might recall what that did for you, how it perhaps reoriented you somehow, rejuvenated you somehow. The word itself means to be inside of a song. So in a way, it can invite us to ask, what kind of song am I in when I'm in that state? Fun recognizes no borders. Delight, I think, is a human right that too few of us enjoy. In terms of enchantment, we're all creative in our own ways. We don't have to be artists or musicians. Everybody's creative and everybody can play. And everybody needs to. Even those of us, and perhaps especially those of us who grew up disadvantaged in one way or another, we still oftentimes found ways to play even when we were kids. I grew up in a violent house. I wasn't poor or anything like that, but there was a lot of violence where I grew up. And so one of the things I learned to do was to, first of all, get outside to escape from it. And then secondly, to play with my friends and with trees and with landscapes as a survival mechanism. And I think doing that helped keep me sane. So if you go to my website, worldread.com, you'll see something called the Declaration of Enchantment. So. Now, this word enchantivism, I wanted something, and there may be a word that does this already, but I couldn't think of it at the time. This was 4 or 5 years ago. I wanted something, a word that would describe what people do when they engage us in story to show us a better possible future. And I don't mean positive thinking. I don't mean denial, or anything like that, or affirmations. What I mean is telling stories that begin in rupture somehow, but they point us in new directions so that they're actually more spacious than the situations they come out of. And so I began toying with the word enchantivism and playing with some images and putting things together. And then I thought, well, why do this? What would be the reasons for this? And so to be against people isn't really enough to mobilize people. It can help. It's good to be clear on what we don't want, what is unjust, what is unfair, but it tends not to be enough, especially highly privileged people. It can take a little more to get us going. So in that spirit, just shaming and judging and moralizing, they don't really work that well. They feel good, but they tend to not really get us where we're going. Defenses like denial are very persistent. They're hard to get around. So when we just have facts and figures about apocalypse and the end of the world and things that are just dark and scary, however necessary it is to know those, and it is necessary, when we go too far in that direction, people just numb out. And they lose hope and they become helpless, which isn't what we want. So I like this quotation from Victor Hugo. The human soul has still greater need of the ideal than of the real. It is by the real that we exist. It is by the ideal that we live. When we tell stories, instead of simply arguing with people, and there's a time and place to argue with people, but when we tell stories instead, it can earn the trust of the audience. It can take us past the things that divide us sometimes, not always. It involves more of the listener's brain than just a straight up lecture. It appeals to emotion and imagination, not just the intellect. Stories stay longer in memory, usually, than just information, a lot longer. And in a way, storytelling offers a pull into a shared imaginal space that we all occupy together, instead of just pushing people with, you should do this and you should do that. So in doing all those things, story can actually move us from overwhelm into hope, if we allow it to. Not passive hope, but what Joanna Macy calls active hope, the hope of actually making things happen. So if you look up the healing and inspiring power of story and then my last name, you should be able to pull this article up. And what I did was I put together the science on what I just said. So the article is primarily a review of the science that shows how persuasive storytelling can really be and exactly why, what the research actually shows us about this. Here is one of my galleries of exemplars. This was another one that was really hard to narrow down because there's so many people doing wonderful work in the world. Those of us who like Star Trek will recognize Lieutenant Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols. She actually was going to quit the show at one point because they weren't giving her anything to do except open and close hailing frequencies. And then she had a conversation with a guy who was one of her fans, and he said, look, we need to see a Black future. We need to see Black people on the bridge of the Enterprise and in lots of other places too. And just by being there, you show us that. Would you please consider staying on the show? That man was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who with his family used to watch that show regularly. So she stayed and she made the most of that role. And now a lot of people know who she is. Amnon Weinstein, he resurrects violins that were used by people in the Holocaust. This started for him at an early age when his grandparents showed him pictures of the concentration camps, and they said, this is our family. This is where our family is. So you've probably heard at some point about the angels of Auschwitz, who were Jews who were made to play Mozart and Beethoven before they were executed. They were forced to do that by their murderers. And so what he does is he finds the violins that music was played on, and he refurbishes them. He's a musician and a craftsman. And then he gives them to people or plays them himself in remembrance of what his ancestors went through. It's so poignant and beautiful. I recommend looking him up. There are stories on the internet about what he does. It's just remarkable work. Mary Robinson was previously the Irish president, and she invoked the folkloric image of the fifth province. In ancient Irish mythology, there's a place in the center of Ireland that's a magical place where everybody goes to reconcile their differences. And as she put it in her inauguration speech, I want my tour of duty to be like the fifth province. I want it to be a time of reconciling differences. Reuben Wu takes pictures of, he's a photographer and takes pictures of mountains, and he moves the camera in such a way that the stars make halos around the tops. So he reminds us that nature is sacred. That's one part of what he does. He has a lot of other work going too. And then Jacinta Tobin, she is an indigenous Aboriginal storyteller from Australia. I'll mention Alondra Nelson. So she's one of the voices behind Afrofuturism. If you've seen the Black Panther film, you've had a brief glimpse of Afrofuturism. And one of the ideas behind it is what I was mentioning earlier with Nichelle Nichols, that when you look into the future, you see everyone. There's also a lot of science fiction and fantasy work about that, particularly science fiction these days. So I'm thinking of Octavia Butler as well. If you read her work, there's some Afrofuturism in it. And then Jacqueline Susskind, who, somebody else to look up online. There was an article in Yes magazine about her saving a stand of redwoods, not just by writing a poem, which is what the title of the article says, but she struck up an informal relationship with somebody that at the time she didn't know this, but they were an executive of the logging company that was about to mow down the trees that she was trying to protect. So that informal behind the scenes relationship helped to save them. So there's a Star Trek show running right now called Discovery, and the protagonist is Sonequa Martin Green. And this is something she said in an interview a couple of years ago. Stories can be so healing, art is so healing. And I think that when you have a story that shows a picture of a utopian future, I think that having a vision of it can help you actualize it. And then one last nod here in terms of exemplars, Ursula K. Le Guin. At this point, realism, this is an interesting thought, is perhaps the least adequate means of understanding or portraying the incredible realities of our existence. And she mentions some examples from science fiction who, in her words, may be talking as seriously as any sociologist about human life as it is lived, as it might be lived, and as it ought to be lived. For as all great scientists have said and all children know, it is above all by the imagination that we achieve perception and compassion and hope. And as we wind down this presentation here, I just wanted to include from around the world a couple of, I won't read them, but a couple of quotations from astronauts who saw the Earth from space and saw a different place from the one that we see on the ground sometimes. As one of them said, you don't have to take a space journey in order to view what we viewed, but all of them went up there as scientists, and there's actually a moment that they all talk about where they're passing by the window of a space station doing research, and they suddenly see Earth from space, and they're so overcome by the beauty of our planet that they just go into a trance. So these are people from the USA, from Germany, from Syria, and also Russia, all saying very similar things. If you can get a hold of it, there's a book, it may be out of print now, or maybe they brought it back in, but it's called The Home Planet. It's a really good book, and it's got huge glossy photographs of the Earth from space, combined with not only paragraphs like I just showed you, but sometimes poems from people all over the world. So here's a takeaway from this presentation. Change the story and you change the game. So that book, The Kalevala, is considered a national epic of Finland. And it came together in the early 1900s, and all it is, it's no blueprint for evolution. It's not a manual on doing activism. It's a bunch of basically folk and fairy tales. That's all it is. But the significance of it was that Elias Lönnrot, who was the man who brought all those stories together, and he wove them together into an epic. He did what he just thought, well, how come Finland doesn't have its own tale? Why doesn't it have its own folklore? You know, maybe we should have a folklore of our own. And he went around and he asked storytellers to put it together. So they gave him material. The Grimms had been doing that in Germany and other people around the world too. And so when this book came out, it had a couple of immediate results. One of them was that people just came up to him in the street and said, "Thank you for giving us back our heritage." And so the Finns eventually stood up to the powerful Swedish Empire on the one hand, the powerful Russians on the other, and got to the place where they were able to be a sovereign nation. So to this day, there's still a National Kalevala Day that's celebrated in Finland. It gave them back their voice through folklore, through story. And then on my screen, it's on the right. This is an activist in Thailand. This was taken just a couple of years ago. And she's using the three-finger salute from the Hunger Games, which of course is a fiction. But fiction changes reality. Change the story and you change the game. So here's homework. Second to last slide, what you can do right now. Well, actually, in 30 minutes when we're done. Think about a story in the broad sense, poem, something that was told to you, a book, a film. I have an example to share if you want one later, that changed how you see yourself in relation to the world. Step 2, practice retelling it a few times and relive it as you go over it. The great storytellers often say that the most effective way to tell a story is to be inside of it when you're telling it. So you never recite it. You actually summon it up in your imagination and you tell it from that place to the audience so that you're actually describing it as much as telling it. Take this story after you practice and tell it to 3 people and discuss why this story changed you so deeply. So now they have the story. And lastly, here's a few resources. We have an enchantivism group online that's free to join in Facebook. It passed 500 people recently. If you want to learn more about terrapsychology, you can either go there or you can just go to terrapsychology.com. It'll get you to the same place. And then that's my professional website, World Read Academy. So it's at worldread.com. So I'll give you a minute just to look at those. And lastly, this is a book I just published through Routledge. And it's on terrapsychology as a research method. So a number of my students contributed material to this book in terms of how they've used this to change their own and other people's relationships to nature, place, justice, each other, and a number of other things. All right.
Thank you so much, Craig. Woo. I took a lot of notes. So before we let people jump in, I just wanted to comment on a couple things.
Yeah.
Do you know of Dr. Mindy Fullilove?
Oh yeah. Remind me, please. Yeah.
Wrote this book called Root Shock. She's a,
That's
a
right.
Black psychiatrist, and
Yep.
that feels very terrapsychological to me.
I'm gonna write that down to remind myself. Yeah. Yeah.
How tearing up neighborhoods tears up people inside and what that means.
Yes. Yep.
I don't think she even talked about nature in the way that we do, but it's very terrapsychological.
Mm.
And I think my own, like a little bit of my own story around rivers.
Yeah.
So I was born in Portsmouth, Ohio, although I didn't grow up there. And there's a major river there that my father told me. I found out much later he used to go swim, and there were even parts of the river that were off limits to him as a Black man.
Yeah.
And then my mother, my mother divorced him, and we moved to San Antonio, Texas, which has a major river. And then when I finally got around to the Orisha, Oshun, who is my other parent.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
The
Yep.
river. So, you know, so anywhere I am, the first thing I do is like, where's the river? I gotta find the river, and just what all that means to me, and how it's healing to me and is needed and all that stuff. So I was just thinking about that when you were talking about
Yeah.
terrapsychology. And one other thing that I think one of your graduate students, or no, one of the members of your terrapsychology group, when he was the geologist, and he talked about weathering.
Yeah.
So, you know, not my main, but my primary way I make money is through public health. And we've been looking at these studies from a Black woman psychologist at UC Berkeley around Black women's health. And she talks about Black women experiencing weathering. So there's this myth that Black people, we grow older and we don't look our age, right? Black don't crack. Term crack, I didn't think about it. Crack and stone and all that.
Yeah.
But she says internally our systems are weathering at high rates because of stress.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that for some reason, his talking about weathering and thinking about stones and everything, how that happens, they've studied that in the bodies of women, of Black women, and how that weathering leads to decay. So I just wanted to share that because it felt like a connection to me.
Yeah. If you email me her name, I could pass that on to Matt.
Okay. Yeah, I will, definitely.
Wow. Internal weathering. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially how racism impacts the health of people.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right? Colonialism, no matter where you are in the world, any oppression, it can create this weathering internally.
Yeah.
Thank you all for allowing me to just ask my questions first. We're opening it up now, so anybody who has anything to say, jump in.
Hi, Craig. Thank you so much. I mean, I was in tears almost at every slide because what you were saying touched me really deeply from lots of point of view. So I really appreciate what you said, and I'm yeah, I should be looking into terrapsychology more. One of the things I just wanted to say from my own experience, rather following along from Phoenix, is that I find that whenever I live somewhere which has trees in the name, like a street or an area, my life is good. And I've found that throughout my life. I've got numerous different places where I've lived and where my children were born, where I grew up. They were, many of those places had the names of trees in the names. I grew up in a cottage called Beechcroft. Beech, like Beech, and yeah, many different places in my life that has really coincided, and I've noticed it as a pattern. So I think that's my thing, trees.
That's a wonderful example.
Thank you very much for that presentation.
You're very welcome. That's a wonderful example of the kind of patterns we look for. I'm very fond of, I don't have the same pattern with trees as you do, but I'm very fond of them, and on a personal level. And when the violence at home was especially bad, there was one tree that has since been cut down in the neighborhood I grew up in, and I would climb it because I knew that my dad couldn't come after me. And so it was only decades later that I reflected on how that tree actually held me through all that trauma. So to this day, I remain grateful to it.
Someone wrote here, thank you. I'm interested in the ecological stories about technology, often understood as oppositional to Earth, and I'm curious whether you could recommend alternate stories that root our technology back to the land.
Yeah, that's a great question. You may have heard of, just to start with this piece, you may have heard of biomimicry, and I'll just type it in. Janine Benyus, and I'll type her name in too. She did at least one TED Talk, I think maybe two, and then wrote a book on biomimicry. But the idea is to actually be mentored by what nature can teach us about science, not the usual science model of dispassion and exploitation from a distance, but to actually think of nature as a mentor. So for instance, how is it that the natural world builds, how is it that termites build mounds that stand up in earthquakes that shake all our buildings down, and that during the summer they're relatively cool and during the winter they're relatively warm? And how does a spider make a web that's so strong without a blast furnace, you know, things like that. And so that's like the surface level of it. In terms of the older stories, the folkloric stories, oftentimes technology is seen in terms of the technology of those days that have long gone by. So I don't know of that many more recent stories, and I think we need more recent storytelling about this, about how the two can work together. But I'm thinking of, for instance, there's an old German folktale and a Hungarian one too, now that I think of it, about this brother, and it's always like the younger brother that gets picked on in these stories, you know, and how he actually made use of some dew from grass next to him and some other things in order to heal himself. So, you know, and then there's lots of stories about amulets and charms of different kinds and talismans and things like that. I think that was the technology of those days in some ways. There's also in folklore, you know, millers who have a harmonious relationship to nature and things like that. So there's a few stories that make it problematic and show the dark side of it, but there's also other ones that say, no, that we can make them work together, you know.
Greg, I have a follow-up question around that, because the word technology, because, right,
yeah,
people use the phrase indigenous technologies. So right. I don't know if the person who asked that question was just thinking about, you know, the iPhone, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know if you were asking me to expand on that.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I am thinking about technology in like a very broad term, so also understanding something like even language as technology, but specifically I'm interested in like our, you know, current kind of like industrialized, digitalized form of technology. Like if you think about like a cityscape, like how do we come to understand these, like even something, yes, like our iPhone, as an object that is not an object, it's something animate, and it actually has relations that go back to the land. Like what are ways that we can create and cultivate this type of perspective that likely wasn't a part of like indigenous worldviews? Like it might have not had technology in the same way. They might have not had the impetus to create these types of stories. So I'm curious, like what we could do, or if there are other alternate forms of storytelling around modern technology that I'm not aware about.
Yeah, one place to look to answer the second part of that first is look at the work of Kim Stanley Robinson. He gets into that a lot. But to go back to the first part of what you were asking, I would go to magic and folk tales and fairy tales and myths for that, because like a while ago, you remember when smartphones got really popular and people, I don't know if they still do this, but people would be waiting in long lines for like a whole night just to get an upgrade on their phone. And the phone wouldn't look any different. It looked like the same phone, but it had additional things that it could do. And I got curious about that, and I started asking people why they did that, because I didn't at first understand why they did. And I didn't believe the more judgmental comments that other people were making, like, oh, they should just get a life, or they're bored, or whatever, you know. I thought, no, there's something numinous for them. There's something magical for them going on here, you know. And so after talking to some people about what that was for them, I realized that in many ways, the phone or little pieces of technology like it are like amulets. That to the unconscious, it's the same thing. And when they get upgrades, they're getting superpowers. So with this little phone, which isn't a particularly great one, I can do things that Merlin couldn't do with his magic wand, for instance, you know. So we're getting magical powers when we get technology. And I think that's both the joy of having it, but also the danger. And there's lots of old stories about what happens when we get enchanted by magical objects. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is one story where the young apprentice wants to enchant a broom and a pail of water so they can do all the work that he doesn't want to do while the master magician has gone. And then they all start becoming autonomous and doing it on their own. And so the thing doesn't get solved until the master magician, who knows how magic works, comes back and calms all the objects down, you know. And I think about that, and I think stories like that, and then in terms of literature, Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, these should be taught in science programs.
Right.
Because as one scientist on the Manhattan Project put it, the tools get hold of you, you know. So they're magical, but they're dangerous. But if we know they're magical, then we're not so spellbound by them, and we can enjoy the magic on a conscious level.
Awesome.
That's where I would go with it.
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't write down the first person's name. Do you remember who that was?
Sorry?
You mentioned someone before Shelley?
Before
Mary Shelley. Who was the person that you mentioned?
Kim Stanley Robinson, or was that?
Kim Stanley Robinson, I think that was it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I like his work a lot. He's really good.
Have you spoken at Google or Facebook before, Craig?
No, I spoke to High Ground Hackers in San Francisco a while back. They were doing a piece on gun violence, and in my past life as a psychotherapist, I worked with lots of violent guys in group settings, which actually I really enjoyed. And so they had me in as somebody who knew about violence and what triggers it, and I did a presentation to them. And that was interesting. I had a little piece on tech and myth and how spellbound we get, so.
Well, listening to you more, I think we'll talk later, but I'd like to offer something in December for our Ecotherapy for everyone, and I would like to just focus on story and enchantivism. So
cool.
I'll talk to you more about that, but yeah, definitely.
Great.
Definitely. Victoria?
Good morning. Craig, that was just absolutely fantastic. I love what you're doing, and I'm very, very interested in learning more. But the question that I wanted to ask was about, so I come from Australia. It's quite a flat country, and I've traveled around a fair bit and seen a lot of it. And we have some towns that sit underneath a mountain, and I've noticed that those towns feel very different to towns that don't sit underneath mountains. And I'm usually thinking about mountains in quite flat landscapes. So they're things that kind of protrude up and have a real presence about them. I'm just wondering if you've got any insight into the energy of that, and how that makes the place feel different. Yeah.
The real experts would be the original people who have lived there. It would probably be in their stories, and sometimes they don't mind sharing the public stories. They won't share the esoteric ones, but I would ask them, and I actually do that as a check on my own perceptions. When I investigate a new place, I try to get a sense of the mythology there and who's there archetypally and all that. But then I check with whoever still lives there, whoever the indigenous people are of that place, and see if their perceptions match mine. And if they don't, I assume that I'm wrong and they're right, because they've been there forever, you know. And then I go back to the drawing board. But in terms of your question, so I'm thinking of a line of speculation about ancient Egypt, and which in some ways has, the further away you get from the Nile, the more flat the desert is. And then at one point there will be a mound that's kind of pyramid shaped. And so the speculation was that that mound, the ancient Egyptians noticed that it looked a little bit like the slanting rays of the sun. And so when they told their stories, they began bringing all these elements together, the elements of the sky and the sun together with the element of the lands that they knew so well. And some of their mythology comes out of that. So it could be that in that case, there's this contrast between a space of flatness. So if we thought of that terrapsychologically, that might be where we're flat, you know, where in my flat, in my moods or in my ideas or in my perceptions or whatever. And then what's rising out of that and giving me a higher view, you know. So that's probably where I'd go with it.
There's someone here wrote, your talk about enchantment reminded me of people such as Patrick Curry talking about the idea of reenchantment, about how we need to become reenchanted with the world again, but how it's not respected because it's not seen as a rational way of interacting with the world. How do you navigate people in validating ecological enchantment with rationalism?
I love this question. I often think of, in this connection, Isaac Asimov, who most of us who have heard the name know him as a science fiction writer, but he was one of those ardent pro-rationalism, pro-science, science has all the answers people, you know. He was, even in his science fiction, he's very scientific and very, you know, and yet he had this fantasy that if he rode in a plane, it would crash. And you always see this, you always see the most rational people, the most logical people, they've got something going on with their fantasies such that, you know, there's some belief they have that other people go, really? You really think that? You know, so I'm bringing this up because I think we all fantasize, we all have to keep our enchantment somewhere. And to give another specific example of this on the other side of it, the enchantment side of it. So my dad, he wasn't a scientist, my mom was a scientist, but my dad was very, show me the money, you know, he was like, if you can't prove it, I won't believe it. And, you know, he was a business major in college, and he spent his whole life working at jobs that he couldn't stand just to make money. And he died pretty unhappy. So after he died, I finally went out to the workshops that he set up around the house where he lived in for so many years. And I had seen them before, but I had never really spent time in them. My dad was a tremendous craftsman. He could build pretty much anything with his hands, you know, and it was always beautiful. He would build a desk that just out of nothing, out of scrap wood, and then he'd polish it and do this and that to it, and it would be like this work of art, you know. And that was where his soul really was. So when I went into his workshops, I saw all these experiments with nuts and bolts and tools and electrical wiring and all this other stuff that he was just fooling around with. And I went, you know, this is where his enchantment lands, right? Everybody's enchanted by something. And for some people, it's just a matter of saying, well, what does enchant you? Where is your enchantment? So that's one way I would go with that too. And the other is I sometimes will talk to people scientifically about why enchantment improves mood or, you know, does this or that, right? But I mean, that whole mentality of disenchantment is part of what got us into this in the, you know, to start with. The world got disenchanted and then we started eating it and destroying it, so.
Another person here, Craig, thank you. You mentioned the difference between positive psychological approaches and enchantivism. Can you say something about the risk for spiritual bypassing, if any?
Sure. Yeah, definitely a potential shadow area. So what I've found is that when people really take this to heart, they get that the stories come out of sometimes shadowy places, sometimes places of injustice, places of cultural rupture, of personal rupture. And those kinds of stories tend not to bypass. They tend to start there, right? So I'm always kind of suspicious when people start with light and love and rainbows and just kind of go, well, let's just think happy thoughts and let's just all think positively together and this and that, because they're creating this huge shadow that the rest of us have to carry. The psychologist James Hillman referred to American pseudo-innocence as a huge affliction in this country, especially among white people and, you know, highly privileged white people, where we actually get offended by those who try to wake us up to how things really are. So that kind of innocence, that kind of pseudo-innocence can be extremely damaging on many levels. Whereas an enchantivist approach tends to say, okay, enchantment isn't about just being positive. As Tolkien pointed out, the writer of The Lord of the Rings and all those other books, an enchanting realm with no danger and no shadow isn't really convincing. You know, it doesn't really get you anywhere emotionally. You can't live there in your imagination. It's too fake, you know. There has to be monsters and darkness and challenges to overcome and all that. So enchantment, the way I'm using it, includes that, the whole range of what's happening. Great question.
Yeah, really great questions and comments. I really appreciate everyone. It's about time to wrap up. So I want to say thank you to Craig again. Thank you so much. This was just really, really incredible. And I'm going to go back and think about stories that land for me and really think about that. We are recording this and this is our last one. So I need some time to rest. I think I bit off a lot. I got really excited. And then when I thought about it, I was like, maybe next time I can cut 7 in half. But, you know, that tends to be an issue of mine around there. I'm learning. I want to thank everyone who has attended, whether it's your first time today, and I want to especially thank the new friends I've made from the UK and Australia and all people who are not from not living in the United States. It makes me so happy that you attended.
Yeah.
And I'm just really grateful. And all your names are added to our list, and I want to stay in touch and stay connected as we continue to spread our roots like redwood trees, because we really need each other.
Yes.
We need each other more than ever. We always have needed each other, but like right now, we really need each other. And so I want hopefully to stay connected. One of the things that I mentioned in one of the webinars is I'm creating an international organization called the Alliance for Ecotherapy and Social Justice. Craig is on the advisory committee. Most of the people that you saw that presented, not all, but most, are part of the advisory council. And so if you want to get involved, if you want to volunteer, please contact me, because it's just me and my counsel, but you know, I'm doing most of it while I also have another full-time job, particularly if you speak another language and if you're not from the United States, you know, because we're very heavily right now United States on the council. I want to spread it out. Please, and if you just want to volunteer or just stay connected, I'd really appreciate that. One of the things that is happening with the Ecotherapy for Everyone, there's a lot of energy. People are engaged, is that I want us to offer free, regular kind of webinars like this. So the next one will be in December, and I'm going to talk to Craig and some other people. I really would like it to be around story and enchantivism as we begin to move into the winter solstice. By then, we will have had our presidential election in the United States, and we are going to need to have some enchantivism.
Yeah.
We're going to need to create new stories, because we are in a bad place right now. So I think it'll be a perfect time to do stories and create new stories and envisioning of our positive future. If you have any comments or questions, please, you can contact me. As you can see, I have a lot of energy around this. It's a passion.
Could you let us know your email address again, please, Phoenix?
Yeah, I'm typing it in right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I just want to thank Craig again. I want to thank everyone, and wherever you are, I pray that you have peace. I pray that you have love. I pray that you have enough that you need to live and a little more to share with someone else. And I give thanks to you and your people and your ancestors and all of the. So I'm really kind of feeling a little emotional right now. So I'm just really grateful.
Mm.
Woo.
Grateful to you too, Phoenix.
Yeah. You know, my mother's birthday is on Monday, and my mother died
wow.
a couple years ago, 2019.
Mm.
So I did this around this time because it just connects me more to her and to my ancestors, and just thank you very much.
Mm. Mm.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you. We'll be sending out follow-up emails, you know, and give people access to the audio and next steps. But I appreciate you all. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody. Stay in touch with us.
Yes, please do.
I'm Jonathan Crump.
Mm.